Paris, 1961. Jacques Rivette sits down in a cafe with Jean Renoir. They plan to have a talk about the cinematic process. Renoir leads the conversation. At a table by the window with a drink each, Renoir begins and immediately declares that the technological progress of the arts have led and will lead to worsening art. Elucidating his argument, Renoir cites examples from Greek art to the biotapestry. He states that works such as these remain objects looked upon with reverence by the people of today, even though the people that made them worked exclusively with what are now deemed primitive materials. Painters worked with dyes that were far more limited. Sculptors used tools far less precise, and still made work we are enamored with. With this, Renoir claims that nothing throughout history of art indicates that the prowess of the technology has made the artistic process superior. In fact, our adherence towards technical perfection breeds decadence. At this point, Rivette attempts to respond to Renoir. He speaks of the progress that technology has offered everyone, including filmmakers. Yet he cannot help but be convinced by Renoir's arguments. Renoir replies that technical perfection can only lead to boredom, as it does not create, only reproduce nature. The ability to sophisticate the dyes and fabrics used from the biotapestry, so that absolute realism could be achieved, killed the art of tapestry. There was no longer any need for the medium which evolved out of its adversity. Progress eradicated all adversity, and any artist that attempt to revive or recreate this form do so as artificial. This brought the conversation to film. Sound and lenses and projection are developed for the sole purpose to progress closer to the real thing. Eventually, art moves from a reproduction of nature and is in direct competition with nature. Renoir concludes the conversation, stating to Rivette that intelligence makes us slaves of all that is ugly. The conversation resonates with Rivette for many years that follow. 7 years later, in May of 1968, civil unrest breaks out in Paris and riots rage for many weeks. Anti-capitalist and trade unions barricade the streets and graffiti slogans onto buildings. Rivette is in the city during this period. Witnessing the events firsthand sparks a fire within him that radical change must occur, and his mind is cast back to his conversation many years ago with Jean Renoir. These two moments become the catalyst for him to completely change his filmmaking philosophy. Having crafted a career of formalist filmmaking, he abandons it for a far more experimental approach. His films become less scripted and less reliant on definitive meanings. It seems as though during his conversation with Renoir, a quirk of the French language occurred. The words technique and technology can be interchangeably used. Rivette decided against the formalism of his work, as it wasn't technology that would make his work uglier, but technique. For where does the differential point emerge between technique and technology? If technology is created to supplement technique, then the development of technologies will inevitably lead to greater accessibility to once inaccessible techniques. By abandoning his technique, Jacques Rivette was actively attempting to make his work more progressive by the radical approach he saw twice in Paris. This leads us to the conclusion that the definition of progress remains in the eye of the person defining it. Japan, 1996. Video game company Capcom launches its franchise Resident Evil. It becomes one of the world's most successful and acclaimed video game series, coining a new genre, survival horror, focusing less on action set pieces and more on item management and puzzle solving. The game is lauded for its design. In order to accommodate the burgeoning 3D technology available at the time, fixed camera perspectives are used to heighten atmosphere, rather than a traditional third or first person perspective. Character movement uses what came to be known as tank controls, so that movement is consistent while complete freedom is given to the position of the camera. Multiple entries within the series continue over several years, and the series evolves its formula while retaining the design ethos of the original, peaking in 2006 with Resident Evil 4. The natural progression of making the games more action-based and thus changing the perspective of the camera while retaining its survival horror roots. The series becomes an exemplar of intentional game design, utilising the limitations of its hardware to its absolute potential. In 2019, Capcom decides to remake its main series entries. They had done this previously, remaking their original 1996 game in 2002, keeping the same mechanics but utilising pre-rendered backgrounds. The primary upgrade being in the department of aesthetics. The 2019 remake upgrade the visual look of the original games. They also implement a completely new design philosophy. Due to the limitations of the technology at the time, the original entries are deemed archaic and therefore irrelevant. The originals have not progressed, whereas technology has, so the original games can become better with technology. The remakes do not have the cinematic camera perspectives, opting for a more traditional industry-standard point of view. The UI does not take place within the diegetic space of the game, instead opting for a more universal, inoffensive look utilised across all games, rather than one catered for each individual design. Tension was built with the player having to choose between moving or aiming a weapon. Now the player can do both actions at the same time, allowing for a lower difficulty curve to satisfy more casual approaches. The design philosophy from the past is now believed to have not been created with these choices in mind, rather that they were a product of their time, which is intrinsically worse and must be progressed. The newer aesthetic choices prioritise photorealism and the inaccuracy of real life. Much how Renoir perceived the avenue of cinema, Capcom operates and thus fuels an industry which is vitally reliant on technological progress. As such, their artistic approach must be altered. Nature operates with organic beauty, not one that is manufactured. In turn, though nature is beautiful, it's reliant on the subjectivity of an individual to craft a story of the world around them. Art, adversely, is manufactured, and thus the implementation of the principles of subjective nature into an objectively designed world means that the aesthetic principles of the latter fall to the wayside. Details and features of an image become overwhelming. A viewer's eye cannot be guided by a light or composition, which is an objective element of design, as Capcom's primary focus is visual realism, a design choice not congruent with clear artistic direction. Visual and sometimes literal instructions are needed in order for people to read its images. Whereas before hardware limitations required legibility through design, design becomes less visible and thus further hand-holding is required. Because photorealism requires so much detail on the screen, Capcom chooses large splashes of colour to guide the player. Although this makes no sense from a diegetic perspective, it's necessary for the image to appear readable. Capcom continues along these design methods, as the aim for the medium of video games clearly demonstrates that this is the more desired option by companies and consumers alike. The remakes continue to be produced and become more critically and commercially acclaimed than their once groundbreaking predecessors. This leads us to the conclusion that every technological change can be defined as progress. The United Kingdom, post-World War II. Buildings are erected, signifying a new architectural philosophy. Brutalism removes mankind's previous notions of decoration and beauty and creates structures wherein the bare building materials are on show and the structure itself is the major design element. The edifices are perceived as the most pragmatic form of building structure, able to be implemented for tenement buildings, large-scale housing, and government facilities. By not focusing on ornamentation or non-ergonomic exterior elements, it excels in efficiency by expelling beauty. Its utilitarian design is inspired by and spurs on the pragmatic mood of the era. Historically, architecture's purpose was to evoke an emotion within people, to combine both the craftsmanship of erecting a structure with the innate reaction one has to an entity much larger than oneself. Brutalism as a movement looks at this as an archaic perspective, and one that's not relevant to a modern sensibility. Rather, everything that existed before needs to be reformed until it's no longer relevant. Much like how Resident Evil has to recreate its original invention until it replaces it entirely. The perspective of a brutalist building is temporal, with no concern for history. Brutalism holds reverence for material rather than presentation, and aims for a form of architecture where people will actually avoid looking at the buildings. Without the decoration of Baroque or Gothic architecture, there is nothing outside of artificial geometry, making them alien to the environment and thus invisible. This way, people are encouraged to better their immediate environment and put more effort into themselves and the things they are able to control rather than the large-scale aspects that should be left to others. Brutalism continues to become such a low-cost, highly efficient form of architecture that it renders all other forms of architecture irrelevant. Brutalism achieves its goal and becomes the preeminent building structure around the world. As time passes, brutalism also becomes synonymous with derelict and abandoned monoliths. The public find the buildings ugly and thus treat them without care. Many buildings are destroyed due to this lack of care over time. The average lifespan of a building shortens. However, due to its low cost and modular construction, another can be erected in its place for the following generation. The public is ultimately unable to avoid its oppressive design, and the lack of beauty instigates a hatred for the buildings by those around them. Though the public do not understand that these buildings represent progress, the philosophical element for architects and those who understand their buildings from a more theoretical level urge their existence. Brutalism eschews the idea of beauty by reinforcing the idea that beauty is synonymous with the aesthetic of a belief system, the ideology being more important than the actual implementation. The intention is good, therefore the building is good. As long as that belief system is for the greater good, then everything is inherently beautiful. This leads us to the conclusion that beauty is purely ideological and ugliness is progress. New York, August 8, 1949. Time magazine publishes an article on artist Jackson Pollock. The subline reads, "Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" For the years preceding this article, Pollock had become a notable figure in the art world, revolutionizing and dismantling traditional Western technique. He forms his drip technique, which would typify his most famous paintings. Rather than using an easel, Pollock lays his canvas on the floor and splashes paint across its surface, dangling his paintbrush, flicking and cascading the pigment in all manner of ways one is expected not to. With an identity of his own, Pollock also merges into the art movement of the time of abstract expressionism. The artists within abstract expressionism value feeling and emotion over formal rules. Their inner world is more important than the outer, and the individual is more important than anything else. This sentiment leads into the 1960s. Andy Warhol spearheads the pop art movement, as concept becomes more important than technique. Art fuses with mainstream culture and no longer demands the elevation of mankind, rather accepts the base culture and elevates those images to the level of sacred icons. The most successful art in the world no longer has to even be made. Rather than changing one's own art to resonate, it makes more sense to simply change the rest of the world. New York again, 1980s. Jeff Koons establishes a factory wherein he hires assistants to work on individual aspects of his art. Inspired by Andy Warhol and evidently the success of Fordism, Koons establishes an assembly line model in which each worker is responsible for a small section of his work and nothing else. Koons describes this as a paint-by-numbers approach. Koons becomes an artist that doesn't even have to touch his work. The art is a product, completely surface level and astoundingly egotistical. His work becomes some of the highest selling artworks by any living artist. Money rules the art world, and now the artist no longer needs to have technique, for he does not even need to touch his work. 1990s, Damien Hirst emerges and demonstrates that not only does the artist not need technique, he doesn't even need the idea. Hirst takes the ideas from many other lesser known artists and becomes the richest artist in the world. Technique and concept are removed in favour of spectacle. Hirst creates NFTs of dots for people to purchase, collectively valued at $25 million. 2019, 2 years previous to this, artist Beeple sells his NFT art for over $60 million. Beeple himself confused as to why the artwork was sold for that much. The art is bought by a man interested in the investment of NFTs as a financial incentive. Beeple just happens to be in the right place at the right time. Art is completely commodified. Such commodification allows multiple companies to incorporate AI art within their process for cost efficiency, just as brutalist buildings are erected, as with enough time there lies no other alternative. Alternative manners of living appear in the distant past, as we rapidly progress without consideration. This brings us to the conclusion that progress will inevitably lead to the destruction of all technique, and nothing will exist anymore. The present day. You walk inside a historical building. You could be anywhere in the world. The building may be ingrained in your culture. You may be in some other foreign land. It doesn't matter. You stand in awe at the spectacle of all that remains around you. Time flows differently in these walls. Walls built by a humble mason echo the songs of those that came before you. You look over your shoulder, and you swear you hear the voices of all the ancestors that came before you. You turn around. You hear their laughter and their joy, and all the thoughts that they expressed, as though they were your own. Inside these walls, you're a part of history and nature all at once. You're one person that makes no difference, and all the difference in the world. You're alive, and you're living. You gaze into the icons, painted by those primitive people, whose humanity gazes directly into and through your soul. You're elevated to something greater than you ever imagined. For a brief moment, you're every human being that ever lived. You're the builder that constructed this building, the painter that adorned it, the poet that filled it with song, the simple man that was humbled in its presence. And you are in the presence of everything. You leave the building and go outside. Where is the builder? Where is the poet? They've been replaced. They've created something else. They've created new things that they're subservient to. You see a coffee shop, a place of purchases. The simple man is now a salesman. You look over your shoulder. There are people everywhere, but the human being is nowhere to be seen. You get ready, for you are the modern man. History extends 40 years back and no further. You could be anywhere in the world. The buildings are erected through a blueprint of absolute functionality. No one feels anything. This is progress. The progress sweeps up the streets like an ocean, and you swim in it trying to keep yourself afloat. Your immediate past sinks beneath you, sinking to the bottom like everything else that came before. It's too late to build on top of it. Everything must start anew. New icons, new ideas, new things. You look around on this new aquatic land. Everything is so much better. It's perfect. There's no more doubt. We're cleansed of our mistakes. We're greater than we've ever been. You experience the new ascension of humanity. You experience no adversity. You pity those poor primitives that came before you. How insignificant they would be in your presence. The modern man, he who has bypassed technique. People used to waste their lives, sculpting for hours at a time to create something imperfect. Now whatever you can imagine will be manifested through concept alone. You, who can 3D print anything greater than the most renowned artisan that came before you. You have ascended through progress. You who can bypass all human ingenuity that comes with creation. You're a genius without even trying. And you float on a new world. There are no rules for you. Everything is how you will choose it to be. By your own will, things will be so. And the water's rising, and for now, you float. You look down to the depths beneath you, and you see nothing. Eventually you too are history. You too, old and forgotten, like all buried beneath the waves that you chose to float upon. And you too will die. You progress, but the water keeps rising. You need to start again. You start over and over and over. Where did that building go? Where are those people that were with you? They lie beneath. You close your eyes and sink deeper, swallowed by the unstoppable ocean. In the silence you try and remember what came before. And somewhere, even in this ocean, they appear. You're an Egyptian scholar, watching Alexandria burn. You're a tribesman, stood on the shore as the ship sailed towards you. You're the astronomer, burned at the stake. You're eventually replaced, dinosaur that you are. so tied to your time, can't keep up with the rate of progress. You miss your technique, you miss your earth, the possibilities that were once around you. You never came to terms with progress. Technique is for the ancients, beauty is subjective, technology your only truth, and all progress is good. Why stop? Keep going. Just let it be, and sink. Don't interfere, and you might not even notice that the world that came before is gone.